Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Solana Chetman. I'm the Director of Creative Practice and Social Impact here at The Shed, and I am truly excited to welcome you to Environmental Justice and COVID-19, our second encounter as part of our ongoing conversation series taking place in conjunction with the exhibition Particular Matters by artist Tomás Saraceno on view at The Shed through April 17th. I want to start by sharing the points of access that are available today. Live closed captioning is provided by Adina King. To turn it on, please click the CC button in the bottom right of your Zoom window. We also have American Sign Language interpretation provided by Rory Burton and Dresden Lamar. So they will both be pinned by our team and therefore should be visible at all times. Please feel free to share any comments or requests regarding your participation through the chat feature, and you can connect with our team at any point. And also feel free to ask any questions for the panelists throughout the discussion using the Q&A button that's also on the bottom of the Zoom window, and we will try to get to most of them towards the end of the conversation. Tomás Saraceno is an artist whose decades-long practice has been dedicated to imagining sustainable futures in an era of climate emergency. One core body of work of his that appears in the exhibition, among others in his newly commissioned piece, We Do Not All Breathe the Same Air, delves into the uneven distribution of air pollution along geopolitical and racial lines across the United States. And it does it through visually accessible data resulting from EBAM machines that kind of suck and imprint levels of pollution on stripes of filtered paper that for this piece were collected from different state government agencies throughout the country. This work has been greatly influenced by science journalists, and one of our speakers tonight, Harriet A. Washington, whose urgent book, A Terrible Thing to Waste, Environmental Racism and Its Assault on the American Mind from 2019, traces the ways in which communities of color suffer disproportionate harm from environmental crisis. When we started putting together this series, Matters for Conversation and Action, in close collaboration with Columbia Climate School and the Saraceno Studio, it was 2019, and we couldn't have imagined what was to come. Since then, COVID-19 has created a level of visible death and a sense of emergency that has forever changed our world. However, to quote Rebecca Solnit, while COVID ravaged across the world, air pollution killed about 3 times as many people, deaths that are invisible, accepted, and questioned. And we must fight the climate crisis with the same urgency with which we confronted the coronavirus. And I will add, we must also understand and address head-on their disproportionate effects on communities of color. This is our second conversation of a series of 6 conversations through which we intend to provide both different entry points and perspectives into Tomás's work, as well as expand on the connections between his work and some of the key contemporary discussions around environmental justice and the intersection of art and science. And we couldn't imagine a more pressing conversation than the one that we will have tonight. We invite you to visit our website for more information and, of course, to get tickets to come see the exhibition in person. I want to thank very especially the Ford Foundation for supporting in making this series possible, as well as our partners and tonight's speakers. Joining us tonight are Linda Good-Bryant, filmmaker and activist, Peggy Shepard, co-founder and executive director of We Act, Harriet A. Washington, science writer, editor, and ethicist, and our moderator, Courtney Cockburn, associate professor of Columbia University School of Social Work. Before inviting them to join us, I want to introduce my wonderful colleague, Alex Schroeder from Columbia's Climate School, and I want to thank her for her ongoing collaboration. And then I will ask Alex that you pass the baton to Courtney, Linda, Peggy, and Harriet. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thank you so much, Solana. Hello, everyone. My name is Alex Schroeder. I'm the Associate Director of Academic Initiatives at Columbia Climate School. I have had the great pleasure to work with Solana and the SHED team to shape this public programming series, which connects to and builds on the incredible and thought-provoking work of Tomás Saraceno. So thank you to both the SHED team and Studio Saraceno for your inspiration and hard work on both the exhibit and this event series. I'm really pleased to be here tonight on behalf of the Columbia Climate School, which serves as the integrated center of climate activity at Columbia University. Our school aims to provide the scholarship needed to tackle the climate crisis and related problems and provide potential solutions through interdisciplinary research, partnerships, education, innovative technologies, and the sharing of ideas. This public program series is a great example of the power of interdisciplinary collaborations, which is one of the core tenets of the school and something that you'll see on display tonight with this wonderful panel. These discussions bring together scientists and artists and policymakers, philosophers, activists, community representatives, and more to explore a diverse range of topics connected to climate change and environmental justice. And on that note, thank you for everyone for joining tonight, and I will hand it off to my esteemed colleague, Courtney Cogburn, who is moderating tonight's discussion. Thanks, everyone.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to join you this evening for this important conversation. Thank you to the SHED, the Columbia Climate School and the Ford Foundation and others who have supported this important discussion. I have personally been engaged with work related to racism and racial justice for more than 20 years, but I am new to work directly in service of the climate crisis and specifically the fight against environmental racism. But these aspects of my work are inextricably linked, and as we'll hear from our panelists, are inextricably linked in their work as well. In my short time working in this space, I have learned that we will fail miserably at meeting the hallmarks of democracy, human rights, and social justice if we do not center the most marginalized and vulnerable in every aspect of climate change work. And more specifically, if we do not meaningfully engage structural racism in its many forms, which includes environmental racism. The COVID-19 pandemic has made it painfully clear that pandemics do not impact us equally, and that there has been, is, and will continue to be an imbalance of suffering until we collectively refuse to live in a world where we accept racial injustice as an inevitable truth. Tonight, let's begin our conversation with learning from these three brilliant and powerful women about how to make this collective refusal and find inspiration in their work that they've done on our behalf to make the world a better place. Art, narrative, policy, collective action, and inspiration are indisputably critical to our fight for climate crisis, against the climate crisis. A favorite quote of mine is that there are those who solve the problems of their disciplines and those who solve the problems of the world. Each of our panelists are helping to address and solve urgent problems of the world, and I'm honored to help moderate our conversation this evening. Please join me, Harriet, Linda, and Peggy, and we'll begin our conversation. I'd like to first ask you to each introduce yourselves. I'll ask Harriet to begin. Can you, in my reading and knowledge of your work prior to this evening, I know that you've lived rich and multidimensional professional lives. You've done all sorts of things over the course of your careers. Can you tell us who you are, and in particular, how you came to the work of environmental racism and environmental justice? Harriet, would you begin?
Sure. Thank you, Courtney. And I will try. The things that are most pertinent to my work around environmental racism are two things I can think of that really stand out. And one is that in the early 1980s, I had a fantastic job. I worked at a poison control center and I loved it. I felt like a detective. Every day I went to work and there were people calling in all sorts of exposures, a lot of children doing mundane things like, drinking things that they shouldn't have been drinking, but also a lot of very exotic things. And one One perennial, of course, was lead poisoning, but it was different from today. In the 1980s, we were focused on keeping children exposed to lead poisoning alive because the standards were very different. We were concerned about children who had 10 micrograms per deciliter, a huge exposure today. But back then, that was the threshold for treating them. And when you had a huge exposure like that, very often you deal with the kid who had an acute exposure, bring them to the ED and treat them and keep them alive. We simply did not have the sophistication nor the resources to usually intently worry about the more subtle manifestations. We knew that lead assaulted the brain. We, among many other things, we knew that many industrial chemicals actually potentiated this damage, but we didn't always have the luxury in the emergency department of actually addressing that. And it's also true that in the news media that covered lead poisoning, you heard about dramatic acute poisonings. You weren't reading about long-term devastation or subtle devastation. And things began to change. I worked at the Poison Center. I began learning more and more about how poisons can be very exquisite in their ability to assail not only the body, but the mind. The assault on the mind is what always fascinated me because it wasn't getting much attention. And we don't tend to indict exposures when we think about things like mental illness, about lower cognitive abilities, about psychiatric illness. And yet we know today that a lot of the things that we're treating are directly tied to early exposure to things like lead and mercury. You know, we diagnose a kid at 14 with conduct disorder, but is he really suffering brain damage from early exposure to lead or early exposure to mercury or early exposure to PCBs? Probably, but we're not quantifying it well enough. I wanted to know more, and I wanted people in general to know more about it to protect themselves. And that was one really strong passion of mine. The other one was the mythology that still reigns around IQ, race, and intelligence. Hereditarian scientists have done a very, very good job of convincing most Americans that people who have low intelligence often have it because they have inherited from their parents, and that in people of color, African Americans, Native Americans, Hispanic Americans, they have lower intelligence because their parents had it and their forefathers. Hereditarians will make the claim that you inherit this, you can't do anything about it. If you're Black, you're fated to have 15 points on average lower IQ than anybody else. This is nonsense. It's not true, but we believe it. The Bell Curve, when it published in 1994, many people read it and were convinced by all the columns of numbers. They didn't really understand the numbers, but they were impressed by them. And I learned that these scientists are scientists, but they're also politicians. A shocking number of them have political ambitions and have used their quote unquote research to fuel policies. Things like denying women in California access to public funds because unless they become sterilized. Things like Richwine of Harvard writing a paper to Congress saying we need to stop Hispanic immigration. Hispanics have been shown to be lower intelligence and prone to criminality. People listen to him because he's a Harvard graduate. But again, these are scientists. I wanted to make the point, these are scientists, but they're also politicians, and they're also funded consistently by the Pioneer Fund, a eugenic group dedicated to the preservation of Western civilization, which they tend to think of as white civilization, erroneously. So these are the things that motivated me the most. My book focuses on the cognitive effects of exposure to environmental racism, and they're profound and they're common.
Yeah, thank you. And could you, and so that we're putting the bios into the chat for everyone to see so that we can move into the conversation. So Harriet, you are an award-winning author and have written about the legacy of racial oppression in our medical system and have moved into this conversation about environmental racism. And it's helpful to hear you talk and think about, to share how you got to this place. Can you speak to why you as a writer are so critical to this fight in the climate crisis? Why are narratives and storytelling around the realities of these systems so important to what we're trying to do here?
Because America's tendency to ignore race when it's inconvenient or embarrassing has led us to carefully curate scientific discourse and the history of medicine to completely eliminate many important issues that pertain to people of color and African Americans. And I see the need to fill in that void. People need to know everything that's happened and all the motivation. They need to know, for example, that although we tend to allude to risks as if they are economic, poor people are exposed to toxicity, uneducated people, that kind of thing. No, people of color. If you look at the data, it's very, very clear that it's a person of color, you are more at risk of being exposed to this. We don't like to talk about that because it's shameful to admit that racism is driving a lot of our healthcare policies, but that's exactly what's happening. And someone has to say it, quite frankly. What I find very often is you have scientists and politicians and academics talking to each other, but all too often, they're excluding the voice of the people who are most profoundly affected. And all too often, the message that filters down to the news media and general public is, curated. It is the messages that indict the systems that we embrace tend to be either soft-pedaled or mischaracterized as economic or completely eluded. And someone has to speak up and point out that this is happening. Someone has to fill in the holes in the dialogue and insist that we talk about things that are not terribly comfortable to talk about as factors for science, like everything else in American culture.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to move to Linda. You are a filmmaker, an artist, a curator, an activist. You have had a varied and again, rich professional career. When I was reading more about you and your work, you struck me as someone who does what you want to do and don't generally take no for an answer. And I'm just meeting you, so I don't know if that's true. That's just my impression. And I don't mean that in terms of your focus on personal interest, in terms of sort of acting selfishly in your own self-interest, but really in terms of using yourself in service and the ways in which art, community, and social change can be leveraged for positive social impact. In my review of your work, you once said that you asked yourself, what kind of world do we live in? Everyone should be able to grow their own food, even if you live on concrete, so let's grow food. And then you quickly realized you don't know anything about growing food or farming, and that didn't stop you. You moved forward anyway. Can you speak to why you would do something like that? What about you would motivate you to take on such a massive problem, even though you didn't have necessarily the immediate skill set that you needed to pull that off? And you've clearly done it. You've built this urban farming ecosystem that I think is just really wonderful. How did you end up in that place of doing this kind of work? And does it have anything to do with you being an artist and the way that you think and engage the world that led you to that work?
Oh my gosh, there are probably a number of factors, not the least of which was that as you know, I grew up in a family of all boys on both sides, which is not an easy place to be. And so I learned to do what I wanted to do, no matter who was trying to get in my way. So I think it starts there. My interest and involvement in both environmental and racial justice just comes from being born Black in America and wanting to live healthily and thrive. I mean, that's just part of daily life. The deciding to start a farm project when I was at that time working as an independent filmmaker is pretty much the quote you used. I was cutting footage for a web series that chronicled the effects of the 2007-2008 global food crisis, where prices on cereal crops increased food prices worldwide and rapidly. Like, it was all of a sudden it cost more And people living on low or limited incomes were not able to buy food. And at that time, I was doing a project that involved people in 6 different cities who lived on low incomes. And so I asked them, back then they were flip cameras. Everybody now knows about our cell phones, but they were flip cameras that we had provided to the various groups and organizations and individuals we were working with, and asked them to film what the impact of the crisis on them personally and their families. And while doing that, which was heartbreaking to hear, mothers deciding not to eat so they could buy formula or Pampers. There are just so many things, trading off one meal so that other family members could have the second meal of the day or the last meal of the day here in the United States. And at the time, there was a lot of comedy around, people going to big box stores and buying 100 pounds of flour and et cetera. But that comedy had nothing to really do with the people that I come from and was working with at that time. It was much more severe than that. And then I decided, let's tell this story globally. How is it affecting people in countries that have limited financial resources? And I wanted to just underscore financial resources. There's so many resources in this world with value. And to me, value that far exceeds that of monetary value, that we get socialized into believing don't have value. And so anyway, in doing, pulling down footage, news footage, I came across some footage shot in Port-au-Prince where people were forced to eat mud pies spiked with little pebbles and honey. And I'm cutting this footage and sobbing and wondering what kind of world do we live in? And at that point, I decided, notwithstanding the fact that I never, ever was able to grow a pea in a milk carton that was cut in half with soil in it, never, ever did it grow, those peas, I decided we should be able to grow our own food even if we live on concrete. And yeah, go on.
And I was just going to say the word, again, audacity comes to mind when thinking about the work that you've engaged. So you're not a farmer. You could barely keep a pea, growing.
Oh, I couldn't grow a pea.
You couldn't grow the pea.
School, forget about it.
What did you bring? What did you bring to being able to create this movement around urban farming, this ecosystem? What did you have that was useful for inspiring and moving this work forward?
What can I say? Someone else telling me no makes no sense. Like no just doesn't work for me. So there's that, and there's the internal voice of no, and I'm going no. I curse like a sailor. I'm going to try not to because we have an audience. But yeah, no, yeah, I can do this, and I'll make it happen. And like I said, I think that just comes from probably being tortured as a girl in a family of all boys. Who knows? But like, I'm not going to let you. No, I'm not sweating you. I'm going to do what I'm going to do. So that's it. Definitely that comes from there, but it also comes from being an artist, curiosity, immense curiosity. What happens if you do this? What happens if you do that? Yeah, I mean, all of the elements of being an artist, being curious, imagining, believing that you can take this imagined reality and make it a tangible reality that other people can experience. It comes from that. Yeah, it comes from a family friend, Mr. Dillard, when I was like 5, 6, 7 and played with his kids, who had a garage that was always locked. And I was like, can I see what's in the garage? And he would say no. And then one day he said, okay. And he opened it up and he had collected all the things that we discarded and brought them back to life. And in that moment, I said, ooh, I want to be an artist. To me, that was art and it was pure magic. So it just comes from that. There's no except the one you accept.
Yeah.
You just keep putting one foot in front of the other.
Yeah.
So, my current work is about creating farms in communities throughout New York City that need fresh, organically grown food to live healthier lives and thrive. And using the resources in each community, we find ways to do that. And to do that on small plots, growing high yields, so that we can distribute food throughout the community, and also to some market rate folks in the city who pay a little more. We make sure that it's income. We use the pricing, method where it's income based. You pay what your income base is. So we do it in small ways, providing opportunities for people to develop farm skills, and we're about to launch plant-based prepared foods who want to develop culinary skills, and then we hire those who want to work with us. There's so many ways we do it, and it is making films is heaven for me. So the idea that I was going to push the camera aside and the computer aside, and start growing food, was just, what are you doing? And I said, I'm going to do something that's more fulfilling. And so in terms of artwork, like using the space and the materials and the activities of daily life in ways that make it possible for people to shape the conditions they need to live healthily and thrive, nothing better than that.
Yeah. I think that some of the biggest, and I hope what's clear in our introduction to you all, is that, we can read about the specifics of what you've done and what you've created and the amazing careers that you've built for yourselves and the amazing work that you do. But I hope part of what we can walk away with this evening is also an understanding about who you are and what inspires you and what pushes you. And again, what got you to this place. And I think sometimes the biggest innovations come from people who didn't start with a specific skill set in that area. The way you imagine and do engage in this complicated work is inspired by being an artist, is inspired by being a sister to a lot of boys and having to fight your way through things and not taking no for an answer. And as we all try to move each other to this collective place of action, I think finding inspiration in what keeps you going and what has pushed you to this place is an important part for us to understand as well. Peggy, I'd like to move to you. You and your team at We Act have been incredibly effective at transformative social change. I mean, just really mind-blowing. Everything from hybrid and electric buses in New York City, BPA and baby products and greenhouse gas and lead poisoning legislation and steering resources to environmental justice committees. My phrase that came to mind when learning more about your work is you get things done. And if it takes 10 years or 5 years or whatever it is, you find a way to get this work done. I would love to hear you talk about how you think about advocacy. There's a part of our work that asks us to explain and convince people to care and pay attention. There's another part, and I might describe that as the polite knock on the door, right? There's another part of advocacy work that requires kicking doors in and doing the work anyway, in spite of your unwillingness to engage and understand. Have you dealt with that dynamic, the polite knock on the door, the call in, as opposed to the kicking in and making people and pushing people to do things anyway? How do you approach that balance in your work and in moving such important legislation and policy forward in ways that really result in tangible change as it relates to environmental injustice?
I came to this work because I had worked in political campaigns around New York City and was able to see the differences between communities, community benefits, community conditions based on the political clout and community engagement and civic engagement of those communities. And so when I had the opportunity to run for office, I had a political mentor, Bill Lynch, who a lot of people know, who helped Jesse Jackson and helped get David Dinkins elected. And he asked me if I wanted to be out front with my own ideas or if I wanted to remain behind the scenes promoting other people. And it wasn't something I'd ever thought about. And I decided I would take that risk. And so I ran as Democratic district leader in West Harlem with Chuck Sutton, who was the nephew of Percy Sutton. The idea was we were going to bring a new political consciousness to the west side of Harlem, which most people forgot because Harlem means, Central Harlem and the Apollo Theater. But those of us over on the west side, near the Riverside Drive and Convent Avenue area, were kind of forgotten. And so I became district leader. I was elected. And the first issue that volunteers came to me about was a sewage treatment plant that was opening up in the Hudson River. And at first we thought it was about jobs. And so Chuck and I went on WBLS radio, WLIB, I don't know if you remember those days. And we were on radio and all these call-in shows, and we told people to go downtown and go to the Department of Environmental Protection and knock on the door and get a job. So we got about 30 people hired. Then the plant began operating and the air emissions were making people sick. So from almost day one, my organization has worked on air quality because those were really the exposures and impacts we were seeing. So, the air emissions from a sewage treatment plant that's supposed to be cleaning up the Hudson River. So it needs to be there. So we're not going to close it down. So how do we get it to operate the way it should? And so that was our first big campaign. We were able to reach out to the Columbia School of Public Health, and I began working with 2 research centers there that do research on environmental health. And over the years, that partnership has really contributed to, the conversion of every single diesel bus in New York City now to hybrids and moving to electric. So it was really the fact that I lived in the community. People came to me and said, it's your turn to provide some leadership, help educate everyone around this issue. And so for 6 long years under Mayor Koch, we organized with at least 100 people coming out on Riverside Drive every month. And until David Dinkins became borough president. Political moment is so critical to all of these issues, especially climate and environmental issues that require such costly infrastructure and technology. And so we were able to sue New York City, get a settlement of our lawsuit for $1 million environmental benefits fund. And then we were off and running. One of our attorneys said, well, I guess you'll use the money to, bring the Sierra Club up to do environmental activities in Harlem. And we said, no, we're going to create our own little Natural Resources Defense Council uptown. And so, that was the start of We Act for Environmental Justice. Started out as West Harlem Environmental Action. And then we looked around and saw the buses. We housed over 1/3 of the largest diesel bus fleet in the country in uptown neighborhoods. And uptown meaning East, West, Central Harlem, Washington Heights, Inwood. And so it was really understanding that there was a strong negative health exposure for me and my neighbors. And this doesn't have to happen, and how do we fix it? And so I became a community organizer. And ever since, we have used organizing and policy to work with the most affected residents of color and low income by the issue. And those are the voices that are rarely heard. And so as a result, not only our Harlem office, but we've opened a federal policy office in Washington to raise the voices and perspectives of the environmental justice movement, because there's a national movement of hundreds of groups doing what I'm doing around the country, and to really raise that perspective in Congress and with our federal agencies. So that's sort of how I've come to this work. Action for me, our theory of change is organizing the most affected to engage in community-based planning and environmental decision-making.
I think that's one, just so inspiring. And as I entered this space myself, it's clear to me that many people just assume that communities of color and Black communities have not historically been engaged in this space and aren't actively engaged in this fight. And it's the work that you all are doing, one sort of counters that in such significant ways. And it's important for us to highlight the work that has been happening and is continuing to happen. I would like for all of you, if you could address, and whoever wants to jump in, help us think about this question of environmental racism. What is that as it relates to your work? What does that mean? And why is it inextricable from thinking about the climate crisis and climate change? Why is environmental racism so important for us to address directly? Why is it so important to your work?
Well, I'll just start by saying that, there's really a complex legacy of racism in this country, whether it's in housing discrimination, the prison complex, police brutality, whatever that sector is, racism has permeated our entire society. So why is it surprising that in terms of environmental quality, that we're also going to be discriminated in terms of, we're consumerist in this country. So where are the products of that consumerism going? And we now know from numbers of research that it's going to, number one, primarily communities of color, and number two, low income. And so race is the primary predictor. And as a result, we understand that polluters often target communities. Why do we have something called Cancer Alley, for God's sakes? And we're all comfortable with that term. We've used it for decades. How can that actually be occurring? And so why, when you see one plant, one oil or gas refining plant, you're going to find another 10 or 15? Why are there some small communities in the South that are host to 20 landfills and solid waste sites? Why in urban communities are highways going through our communities and our schools and parks facing out on highways where people are really impacted by air pollution? The fact that 80% of Latinos in this country live in a non-attainment area for clean air standards, and over 70% of African Americans, tells you why more Black people were dying of COVID. Because, as the Harvard study showed, folks living in the most air polluted communities died and got sick. Mortality and morbidity rates were higher than any other community. So environmental racism is about that intentional targeting of pollution in communities of color because they're less powerful, less informed about the issue. But it's also the lack of diversity in green groups, in our green national mainstream groups, the lack of diversity in our government agencies, in philanthropy, in the commissions and boards that are deciding on utility costs and water costs. So again, it's a continuum of racism, and we shouldn't be surprised that it also affects our communities, our health, and our education.
Harriet, anything to add? I know that you've written about this directly. Why is this so critical? Why is this such a critical piece? And I think in your writing and work, you emphasize the significance of race, just as Peggy has done. It's not always a story of socioeconomic status. Race is a significant factor here, specifically. You're muted, Harriet.
I know by now. Okay. It's racism, not race, that creates the risk. And it's also a historical reality. The thing about systems is you don't need an actor of ill intent Once you have set a system in motion that generates higher risk, higher death, and lower resources for a group, it does its work without the need to implement any racist motivation or racist intent. And yet, what happens when people of color have tried to sue? Polluters. They've been told by the court all too frequently, they've been told by the court, it's not enough to prove that you're disproportionately affected. You have to prove that the intent was to target people of color. That's absurd. That's an impossibly high barrier. We have to remember it's a very American phenomenon, and it's a phenomenon that's been with us since the 17th century. Segregation is to blame. Segregation is something that existed during enslavement. African Americans, most slaves were kept in the worst parts of the land, the areas where animals were, where pathogens abounded, where there was very little protection from the elements, where there was what they called malarious climates, areas known to be unhealthy, as far from the white encampments as possible. And that didn't change in our country. We maintained segregation. And in speaking with Dr. David Williams a few years ago at Harvard, he reemphasized that it's an illusion that segregation has ended. We still have segregation in this country. We don't have residential parity. In fact, if we wanted to have residential equity in this country, 2/3 of African Americans would have to move somewhere else. So segregation is still with us. That alone raises our risk, but there's more. The fact is that polluters are people who make money by not attending to the health effects of the pollutants they dispense. They make money by not allowing proper testing or conducting proper testing, by not safeguarding the health of people there, by not entertaining the vulnerability of people there. And to preserve that, they find the course of least resistance are people of color. People who are less likely to be able to go to the courts for the reason I said. And so we have this kind of conspiracy. You don't need to have evil actors have a conspiracy. You have to have institutions will do it quite well with joint interests in saving money and a lack of concern about the health of people of color. And that's what we've got. And then you compound that with the fact that our public health systems, which do a good job, I'm not saying they don't, they do a good job, but they have serious flaws. Look at the EPA. The reins were handed by Donald Trump to someone who vowed to ruin the EPA. That was his mission. Now he was running it. The EPA quite efficiently rolled back a lot of the protections that we've been enjoying since the Nixon administration. And so the EPA, far from protecting the health and rights and protecting Black people from exposure, they actually compounded that. They lowered the rates. The things that had been put into action during the Obama administration for protecting people, they actually ended. Under Obama, the mercury plants, emitting plants were being shut down. There are only 4 to go. But the EPA decided, no, we're going to stop shutting these plants down. No, we're going to stop having surprise inspections. We're going to warn the polluters when government inspectors come. You can imagine how efficient that turns out to be, right? So we have we have a synergistic effect from our unwillingness to protect people of color. The courts are not protecting them. EPA is not protecting them. Government groups that we are paying for through our taxes are not protecting us. And so people are being herded into sacrifice zones, people of color. And yet there's a reluctance to admit that that's what's happening. This language, the semantics are really distorting what's happening. They are confusing a lot of people into believing that we're looking at a socioeconomic issue. We're not. We're looking at a racial issue. There are all kinds of studies. There's no question about that. The data clearly show, but the discussions talk about socioeconomics. In fact, if you read the accounts of Flint, as I did, I went back years to find out what the coverage looked like early on. And until 2016, the people in Flint who were being assaulted heavily with a variety of toxic chemicals were described as people who were poor, low socioeconomic. Only very late in the game was there an admission that, okay, we're talking about Black people and people of color. And so these semantics are operating against us. Even today, New York Times article, seeking to evade the fact that we're talking about a racial issue. And the data, I can't stress it enough. It's not a matter of opinion. The data are very clear. There's no ambiguity here. Studies are showing things like African Americans who earn $50,000 a year, solidly middle class, right? They're exposed to more toxicity than profoundly poor whites in Appalachia who only earn $10,000 a year, but have less environmental exposures. It's clearly race we're talking about. And for some people, for some white people, it's difficult to admit that. You know, it sounds better to say that poor people are at risk than to say that Black people are at risk. And unfortunately, the question is, who are we more concerned about? The feeling of shame experienced by white people or the deaths and disabilities of masses of people of color? We have to decide that as a country, what we want to do.
I think the frames that we use to describe these issues are critical. The language that we use, right? Is it the evil people and the sort of mystical figures who are doing harm, or concrete patterns, clear data, et cetera, that document the nature of these harms? But let's pretend for a moment that we don't have to spend so much time convincing people that racism is real and that environmental racism is real. And we have very clear data, right, of who's being most harmed by the climate crisis, because it's not up for debate and it's very clear. The data very clear. So let's pretend our audience tonight agrees with us and we're all on the same page. What do we do next? Because you all are not only engaged in this piece of advocacy that I talked about of describing and convincing people, which is a part of being in this space. The other part is making choices to change and doing action. I think about the work that you're doing, Linda. That is an action. That is an act that is working against these very systems. What levers do we need to pull? Not only as individuals, right? You're working from a political perspective, legislation and policy. We're situating this work in a historical context. We're building systems in communities to help promote access to healthy foods, et cetera. What levers do you think we need to be pulling, sharing this assumption that racism is real, environmental racism in particular, and that we have clear data to start steering our decision-making and policies in this space? Linda, you pulled some specific levers. What do you think? Why was that the lever you pulled? And what do you think we need to be doing in response to some of this?
I come from a place of believing in self-determination, and that we need to assert that to be one strategy toward change. And we can do that in the places where we live, working collaboratively together as a community. That to me, I think, is just one of many strategies, but a very critical one, because then people are able to experience a power that society denies, right? They're able to experience and build on that, and I believe shape the conditions that are in their community. Obviously, pollution and the state of our environment is not something that can be done just in the community. But I think it's very key that community be self-determined in how it addresses it with resources it has.
I agree 100%. It's one critical piece of this puzzle. I think moving to other pieces of the puzzle, Peggy, you think about this, right, in terms of you don't end pollution through self-determination. That's one piece of this. You need legislation, you need policy. What are some of the key levers that you think we need to be pulling? What kinds of things are you all focusing on as critical next steps?
Yeah, I don't want us to jump to policy without really understanding that we've got to create advocacy systems in communities of color. We have a lot of social service groups. We don't have advocacy groups for the most part. Maybe there's a tenant group, or maybe there used to be an AIDS group. But otherwise, we don't really have these kinds of advocacy systems. So the lack of civic engagement and real grassroots political engagement, not being subservient to some, congressman who's in your district, but real political activism is really important to engage the people who are most affected. And, when we hear that people of color and low income aren't that interested in these issues. Number one, people of color rate higher on surveys on climate than any other folks. And then secondly, our membership, 20% live in public housing, and I'd say 80% are Latino and African American, and we're getting like 100, 120 people Saturday morning every month on Zoom. And of course, we don't all have access to Zoom. And so that's what keeps me getting out of bed every day. I mean, that makes me feel relevant, that we're trying to create a community that has some relevance and that we are supporting people to take those actions themselves. So certainly that, but we've got to do the coalition building. We've got to have the partnerships with science and academia, because we need that technical expertise. We need the health data. It was the Columbia Children's Environmental Health Center's backpack air monitoring with pregnant women, and then studying their children, the resulting children, that gave us the ammunition to continue to hammer the Metropolitan Transit Authority for 18 years. Let me repeat that, 18 years. But it happened. But without that data, and the fact that it was a community-based study of women in Harlem and the Bronx, it was very, very important. And so having those kinds of partners also adds to not only our credibility as a community group, but academics' credibility as a sincere and committed partner. And so that is an important lever to pull. And certainly, you just can't do this without elected officials, unfortunately. And I shouldn't say unfortunately, it's a joke, but you've got to know who are the people on the committee that is important to your issue. You've got to have relationships with those people. You've got to be sponsoring legislation, getting sponsors on legislation, and really pulling those policy levers. But again, the thing we've got to understand is you could do something in a year, or it could take 18 years. And it's really about the political moment. And right now with the Biden administration, we're hoping we have that moment. It seems to be closing a bit, but we still have a little optimism that something better might happen in terms of environmental and climate justice. We'll have to see.
And I see that the point is well taken, Peggy, about advocacy systems and grassroots civic and political engagement. And I see your point and Linda's point as being sort of inextricably linked, right? That self-determination, that's community-driven activism and advocacy and movement and problem solving and solutions coming from the communities that are most affected by the harms of the climate crisis, and creating systems and infrastructure that help them take care of themselves, in addition to advocating and holding our politicians more accountable and engaging them in this work as well. It seems like that's a critical piece of doing this. And
of course, philanthropy is critical.
We need money to do all of this, right?
All of us here understand the racism and the bias that has taken place in philanthropy for so many years. That's opening up certainly a bit more lately, thanks to Black Lives Matter and the whole host of terrible events we've had over the past year, George Floyd's death and murder, and others. But again, every sector of our society is playing a role in this challenge. And without the resources, without a national movement, no one group can do any of this alone. You've got to really build that strong coalition as well.
Yeah. There's a question from the audience.
I would actually like to weigh in on this, if you don't
please,
mind.
sure, Harriet, no problem.
Because I've written about this, I have a very different take on it. And that is that advocacy is indeed important. In the last 2 chapters of A Terrible Thing to Waste, I devoted to community advocacy and things that individuals can do to protect themselves, but it's not enough. We can't rely upon individual action. And there's no need to. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We have a government. We pay tax like everybody else. We need to have a government that will devote resources to maintaining and protecting our health. And that can be done. I think that's the proper direction for more effort. There has been a lot of advocacy attempted by communities, and some of them have worked long and hard. Many have gotten nowhere through no fault of their own when it comes to affecting the law. Look at Afton, North Carolina. 6 weeks of protests carried by the news, and they still were not successful. And look at Anniston, Alabama. They've won several large lawsuits, but in the end, they're still left with a poisoned community, sick children, and now the clinic that was set up to help them has shut down. I think that it's very, very important to tap into governmental resources and make sure that we get our share of that. And that has to be done through political action. It can be a variety of types of political action, but it seems foolish to me to not do everything we can to force the government and force public health institutions to do what they should to protect our health, like everybody else's.
Sure. Yeah, I don't see that as a different take. I see that as an elaboration on what was already being said.
Well, no one had talked about it, so I brought it up.
Yeah, I don't think we were saying, I think we talked very explicitly about policy and legislation and civic engagement, which I think includes holding governments and political figures accountable, and also talking about the importance of work happening in communities. And I think we were explicitly stating, right, that these are some of the levers that can be pulled. So I don't think anyone was arguing that the community-based work and efforts are more important than other issues. And I think
since no one brought it up, I thought I would, and also talk about the fact that if we're going to have the government undertake attention to this, it's important to make sure the government labels it as what it is. Addressed it as a problem of racial imbalance.
You raised an important point earlier about the challenge of the legal definition of racism and racial discrimination that doesn't quite align with reality, and that's a big barrier. Yeah. But I agree that all of these pieces are critical, and that this is fundamentally a structural problem that requires structural solutions. But engaging communities and creating infrastructure within communities so that people can also organize themselves and figure out how they'd like to build their communities and solve these problems. What types of policies do they think would be most effective, et cetera, is also a critical piece of this puzzle.
Right. As I said, I wrote a chapter about that because it is so important, but historically it has not been very effective through no fault of the people, electing to do it. They've been met with, very
racism.
Unfair, unfair and possibly, illegal barriers.
Yeah.
To doing what they do.
Yeah. We're closing out, and one of the audience members asked a question about what do we do? And we're talking a bit about some of that. And I think you've alluded in some ways to people thinking about their sphere of influence, right? Related to the point around philanthropy. You don't need to go start your own organization, maybe send money to Linda and Peggy and help them do the work that's already happening in other community-based organizations, but also, right, this question around political engagement and pulling those important levers as well. Who have been important partners for you in getting this work done and really seeing forward movement in these areas? We don't have to get specific. We don't have a lot of time, but who are critical key partners in helping us move forward in this space around environmental justice and environmental racism?
Well, I think Earth Justice has been very helpful to communities that reached out to it. They are lawyers who focus on environmental issues, and they help communities and prevent them from reinventing the wheel, and also help them with paperwork that can be extremely intimidating and very difficult to navigate. There have been groups I read about that devoted a lot of time and in the end were unsuccessful because they had filled out the wrong paperwork, even though they were directed to the wrong paperwork by the EPA. Earth Justice is a group of lawyers that will prevent things like that from happening and help people to focus in the best way. So I'm very happy about what they've been doing.
Yeah, Earth Justice is a wonderful organization, and they're really working to be more diverse and to focus more on community-based challenges. I would also say law schools have been very helpful to us on the Columbia expansion into West Harlem. We had Fordham Law School working with us. They had an open house every week for community residents to come in so we could help them develop their testimony for the years of hearings that happened. And we created a community benefits agreement as a result. Columbia School of Public Health, Mount Sinai have been very helpful in terms of research and data and support, being able to have experts come to the city council and testify, not as an advocate, but as the fact, to the facts that they know about. So, and of course, other community-based organizations and the big mainstream groups, some of them at different times can be excellent partners.
In the work with regards to growing food in New York City, the partners it's a wide range of partners, and it starts obviously with the people living in the community. It includes the stakeholders in that community, or other stakeholders in the community, from medical providers to, interestingly enough, developers who, when we partner with a developer, we put them through hell to vet them in terms of their position on gentrification, et cetera. What type of housing are they building and stuff, and form partnerships with them so they provide rooftops for us to grow food on, or a ground space for us to grow food on. It's the schools, the public schools. We're in the public schools working, providing opportunities for students to learn experientially, which is just not a method of learning in our school systems today, our public school systems. I could go on and on and on. And it really does take a village. It's not one, but many, many, many. And the universities, I will say that. We have many partnerships with universities located here in New York City that are providing everything from professional faculty, staff to students to help as we envision a better future. So.
And I hope we can continue to expand university commitment to doing less harm and doing more good as it relates to this work. Thank you all for joining us. I know it's always a challenge in an hour to distill your vast experiences and thinking and work in this space, but I hope our audience has been inspired by you and the important work that you're doing. This is difficult, challenging, complicated, long game types of engagements. And thank you so much for taking a moment to help us learn more about your journeys and the work that you're doing. And thank you for your contributions to this fight. You are each invaluable to our growth and progress in these spaces. Thank you to SHED, the Climate School, and the Ford Foundation for hosting the series. And I look forward to our ongoing conversations in the series and beyond. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Night.